So the purpose of workplace coaching is to help enable your employees to become, quote-unquote, star performers. And so with coaching, the goal is to give employees feedback that they're actually going to apply. And you do this by using a format, giving employees room to overcome problems and to discover their own solutions. And so coaching provides an environment that engages your workplace, and it helps foster independence within your team. It helps your employees develop in their careers and reach their full potential. And so coaching is a process that if you haven't done it before, it can actually take a while to get used to. But ultimately, it can yield really great results for you and your team. And so when you learn a coaching management style, it's something that you can just informally integrate into your day-to-day management of your team. And so much of your coaching, it's going to be informal as part of your ongoing conversations with your employees. But you can also have more formal one-on-one coaching meetings with your employees as the need arises. And so, for example, when you see untapped potential in your team members or training that needs to be reinforced, or if you have an employee in a new job, or if you have an employee that's struggling a bit. And so a really common question that I hear is whether you should use performance evaluations or coaching. And the answer is both. So the two aren't mutually exclusive. So coaching focuses on helping employees advance their career development over time. It helps employees do their current jobs more effectively. Coaching focuses on continuous improvement throughout the entire performance management cycle. Performance evaluations, which are often done annually, document the employee's performance goals and objectives and development goals. They assess performance for the prior review period and set objectives for the period going forward. And so if you've been using coaching on a regular basis, there should be no surprises when it comes to the performance evaluation time. Okay, so it's time to drill down into much more detail on what coaching is and how to do it. And so here's what we'll cover on the next couple of slides. I'll provide a definition for coaching and introduce in more depth what coaching is. And then I'll differentiate coaching from progressive discipline. And then we're going to cover some tips on how to coach, including creating the right environment, asking the right questions, and some practical tips for some common types of coaching conversations. So the Harvard Business Review Guide to Coaching Employees defines coaching as a style of management primarily characterized by asking employees questions in order to help them fulfill their immediate responsibilities more effectively and advance their development as professionals over time. The fact that this style of management is characterized by asking questions of employees, that's really important. So among other things, this helps employees become problem solvers and not just look to their supervisors for all the answers. So we'll talk in much more detail about how to ask these questions shortly. So one thing about a coaching approach is that it's not a so-called top-down approach. It's going to put the ownership of an employee's performance with both the manager and the employee. And the process of resolution is created between the manager and the employee, and it becomes the employee's responsibility to find ways to solve any issues under the manager's guidance. So coaching is going to require regular and open communication between the employee and the manager. It requires trust between the manager and the employee. And I'll talk more about creating trust and creating conditions for successful coaching shortly. Coaching empowers the employee to take an active role in their career development. And it empowers the employee to be solutions-focused when looking at issues related to their job. So this approach enables employees to learn a lot, but sometimes it can initially take a bit more manager time. And it's also not going to work in all workplace environments. The company has to be supportive of such an approach. So really bureaucratic, so-called top-down style organizations that are more command and control, so to speak, they may not be the best candidates for coaching. So studies have shown that a coaching style of management, it can create greater employee engagement and commitment, it can improve performance and accelerate talent development. Coaching can create a positive work environment. So when employees are coached, they feel supported and encouraged by their manager and the company. Retention can improve because employees are more loyal and motivated when their bosses take time to help them improve their skills. And so when performance increases, ultimately, it means that customers are better served, and that can have a positive impact on the company's bottom line. And so I think you're probably going to agree with me that those are some pretty good arguments in favor of a coaching style of management. And so before we learn more about how to coach, let's compare and contrast coaching and progressive discipline. So we've talked a bit about how coaching and performance evaluations are two separate things that can sometimes be confused. And sometimes I also find people confusing coaching with progressive discipline. So I'm going to spend a couple of minutes talking about how those things are different and when each one is appropriate. I'm guessing that most of you are probably pretty familiar with progressive discipline. Progressive discipline typically follows some steps of verbal counseling, written warnings, and then some other consequences, and finally termination if behavior doesn't improve. And while progressive discipline does help protect the employer from liability resulting in discrimination charges and lawsuits, it does often fail to bring about the kind of behavioral change that transforms employees into fully functioning, committed team members. A benefit of progressive discipline is that it provides clear expectations and consequences for failing to meet those expectations. However, the system can be seen as inflexible. So if it's not applied consistently, it can be viewed as discriminatory. HR and management have to make judgment calls about when to deviate from the prescribed steps. For performance-related matters, progressive discipline can also be difficult to implement in a positive, solutions-focused way, as the format can be viewed as a series of quote-unquote punishments. Another thing is that using company disciplinary procedures to address employee issues puts the ownership of the issue on the manager and the Human Resources Department. The employee is then asked to take whatever course of action the manager and HR decides upon. So this can create compliance, but also resentment and no real change in the employee. So unlike coaching, there's no employee ownership of the solution. With progressive discipline, employee behavioral change may be motivated by fear and may happen only when the employee is closely monitored. This can be a negative way to motivate an employee, which, unlike coaching, doesn't increase morale or engagement. And so a final pitfall of progressive discipline is that it's often used after a termination decision has already been made. And so it can be really common that a manager might have decided that an employee isn't capable of changing, or may have waited until a situation got bad and then is simply creating documentation to reduce employer liability. So this misses the point that when done well, corrective action can correct behavior and actually motivate employees to turn their behavior around. But with all of that said, it is important to note that some situations truly are better suited for progressive discipline than coaching. Progressive discipline will generally always be appropriate for certain policy violations, such as sexual harassment or most types of misconduct. In these situations, it's important to ensure that the employee has written notice of the infraction and that there's documentation for the file of what's happened. It's important to make it clear that these situations are disciplinary in nature. Other types of misconduct, such as unexcused absences, also generally lend themselves better to progressive discipline than coaching. Some employee performance problems could be handled in certain situations or workplace environments with progressive discipline and in others with coaching. Or in some cases, when coaching hasn't worked to improve performance, progressive discipline can be the second step used. So let's look at a couple of specific scenarios to show how a manager might decide whether to use progressive discipline or coaching. So in our first scenario, we have Maya, and she runs a marketing firm with clients that are charged by the hour. So her employee, Will, is responsible for generating and sending out invoices to clients by the 5th of each month. But for the last couple of months, the last 2 months, Will's not been getting the invoices sent out until the 10th of the month. This has caused a delay in the client's paying, and in turn, that's been making payroll a little bit too close for comfort. So how can Maya handle this? All right, so some managers, they might handle this via progressive discipline, having a conversation about the problem and then doing a written warning about the issue. But in this situation, that's really actually not a particularly effective way to get at the issue. As we discussed previously, using progressive discipline might create behavioral change, but it's likely motivated by fear. And then additionally, in this situation, progressive discipline could actually just miss the boat completely because Maya really needs to get to the heart of the issue, which is figuring out what's causing the invoices to be late in the first place. And so with progressive discipline, Will would basically be told, you're in the wrong, now the behavior needs to change, and if it doesn't, it could lead to additional disciplinary action up to and including termination of employment. But let's assume that Will has a roadblock in the way of success, so that approach doesn't really help the employee solve the problem. the performance isn't likely to change without additional assistance and coaching from the manager. So I would likely start with a coaching conversation in a situation. And that conversation could reveal all sorts of things about why the invoices are late. And those are going to be opportunities for the manager to help the employee improve performance through positive interactions as opposed to the punitive tone that progressive discipline can often take. And so one question that might be a good conversation starter would be, please help me understand why the invoices haven't been sent on time for the last 2 months. And so maybe in a situation, the answer to this question might reveal that Will's having problems getting billable time reports in a timely manner from his peers in the department. He could be assuming that the other employees understand deadlines that might not be as clear to them as he thinks that they are. Or he could also be reluctant to send requests to his peers for information. And so Maya's having a better understanding of this could further build into other coaching questions that could reveal that Will needs some work on relationship building with his peers. And she could work with Will on coming up with strategies to manage getting the information hours worked for the clients from his peers in a more effective way. And then it's very possible, if handled this way with positive support from his manager, Will could develop in the areas of communication with peers around requests for information. And he could learn some time management strategies that enable him to send out the invoices in a timely manner. And so as such, not only was his immediate performance issue be solved, but Will could learn skills that apply to other situations as well. And so to further the previous example, so let's just say that when Maya approached Will and says, please help me understand why the invoices haven't been sent on time for the last 2 months, he gets really defensive. Then how should Maya react? So in the event that an employee responds very defensively, it doesn't mean that you would immediately change approach, but it could mean that there isn't trust or that the conditions for coaching may need to be established. So coaching works really well for performance or development issues when they are manageable and when the employee is ready, willing, and able to engage with the manager in resolving the issue. And additionally, there could be one employee for which in the exact scenario coaching would work great, but in another situation the employee just isn't as responsive to coaching. So let's say that Maya starts working with Will using coaching and learn that he wasn't getting the information on client hours from peers in a timely manner. But as Maya continues to coach Will, and together they come up with some ideas about more effectively managing the request to his colleagues, his attitude to the coaching is not great, and there isn't improvement in the timeliness of the invoices being sent. And then it also comes to light that Will's spending considerable amounts of time during the day surfing the web on non-work related tasks, and that's contributing to the invoices going out late. So this would be an example of where it would make sense for Maya to switch to disciplinary action because Will's not responsive to coaching. A next step could be counseling Will regarding the use of work time for non-work related activity and its impact on his work performance. So it would be important to document this conversation and the work expectations that Will is expected to meet. Counseling can be a phase 2 approach in situations where an employee requires additional support to be coachable, or they need to get to a place where they're willing to work with you to resolve the issue in a more participatory manner. Disciplinary action can then become necessary when the person hasn't engaged with you to resolve the performance concern, and more formal action then becomes necessary. So before we talk about the specifics of how to coach, we're going to talk about some important things that need to be in place to make a coaching management style effective. So in order for coaching to be effective, the right environment must exist. So managers using a coaching style should see themselves as a facilitator that helps the employee achieve their highest potential. In the next several slides, I'll talk about some of the behaviors that managers should exhibit to be successful coaches. So trust is an essential ingredient in coaching relationships. Trust enables the employee to be open to the lessons that come from coaching. Trust means that an employee will believe that their manager is providing coaching for the purpose of developing him or her, and not just as a means of getting the job done. Without trust, employees likely won't be fully truthful about their goals and weaknesses, or about how they see their role in the organization. So think for a second about a manager that you didn't trust. How likely is it that you would really confide in them about areas in which you knew that your performance needed development? Chances are you'd be worried that they could use that information against you in some way. But on the other hand, in a trusting relationship where you feel like a manager really has your back, you're a lot more likely to be open. So I could, create an entire training on creating employee trust, but here's just a couple of ideas. So a really easy way to build trust is to consistently spend time with your employees and hear what they have to say. So in other words, just checking in with them, getting their input about how things are going. And when you have that type of meeting with your employees, make sure that you really listen to them. That time isn't about performance feedback or coaching or about you. And then, this is probably going to sound a little cliche, but, managers, they do lead by example. And then you build trust by having your behavior match your words. And then being transparent about decision making and with giving feedback is also going to build trust. Employees, of course, they're not going to always like all of the decisions that managers make, but when leaders explain why the decisions were made and when they're open to questions, that's going to help build trust. Encouraging dialogue among your team and then soliciting team feedback, that's also going to help employees feel empowered and as well trusting of their leader. And then another way to build an environment of trust is just to recognize that all employees have their quirks. We all have our differences, and allowing everyone to be themselves in the workplace. And then finally, acknowledging employees for their work. That's also going to be important, but it has to be authentic, because if it's inauthentic, that's not going to help build trust. It can actually have the opposite effect. Now I'd like to introduce you to a concept called the growth mindset. A growth mindset is one that assumes that your employees can learn. In contrast, a fixed mindset is the belief that a person won't make progress. If you've ever found yourself thinking, my employee will never be able to accomplish this task, or he just doesn't get it, then you are thinking with a fixed mindset, or the belief that a person won't make progress. Don't be too hard on yourself, because we've all probably done this at one time or another. But keep in mind, low expectations severely limit your ability to coach an employee. While there are occasionally people who are unable to develop, more often the actual barrier is the belief that a person won't make progress or succeed. And a fixed mindset also leads you to do things like not delegate, do things yourself that the team could do, and provide answers instead of allowing the team to learn by doing. So adopting a growth mindset, or one that assumes that your employees can learn, means that you focus feedback, both positive and negative, on the employees' efforts to achieve their goals, not on their inherent abilities. And so when employees fail, you focus on the learning from the experience and on understanding the areas where doing something differently could have resulted in success. So here's some ways to shift to a growth mindset. First, you're going to want to assume a positive intent. You want to appear curious when speaking with your employees, not critical. So even in the face of what appears to be a negative situation, allow yourself to remain open to other perspectives. You might learn that there was a perfectly logical reason for your employee to do what she did. It may be that something that first appears negative on the surface actually has a more neutral or positive outcome. If the situation didn't work out well, but there was a logical and positive reason behind it, I would recommend that you focus on the learning that can be found in the situation. So in other words, instead of focusing on the situation as a mistake or a failure, take a positive focus and look at the lessons that can be learned from the situation. And you're always going to want to listen more than you talk, allowing the employee to really feel heard. This is a strategy that builds trust with employees, and you're also allowing the employee to find solutions instead of giving it to them. You also want to keep the mindset that the employee has the solution and that the manager's role is to facilitate finding the wisdom within. While it can definitely take some practice, once an employee has been trained on the job, resist the urge to tell your employees how to do something. So allow the employee to think through things on their own. Always ask before you advise. Allowing the employee to come to their own solution, it's going to facilitate their development. It will allow them to learn more than if you tell them what to do. It's also going to create employee buy-in to the solution and allow you to remain open to other possible ways of doing things. So I know that that one might be difficult for those of you that are used to working with entry-level staff or when you've always been the expert in your field. Some people can feel a bit insecure about allowing employees to come up with answers because they feel like as a manager they should have all the answers. But again, with a coaching approach, you want to help the employee find the wisdom within and act in a more facilitative role. And then it can be really tempting to do this, but don't say what you would have done differently. A coaching mindset recognizes that there's many ways to get a job done and many different work styles that can all be effective. Your goal is not to create another version of you. Focusing too much on your own personal work style can be limiting to an employee's development. So now I'll give some guidance and specific tips on how to talk to employees when you're coaching them. As a reminder, going back to our definition of coaching, it's a style of management primarily characterized by asking employees questions in order to help them fulfill their immediate responsibilities more effectively and advance their development as professionals over time. So developing the style, it really is about learning to ask powerful questions in your everyday management interactions. Instead of giving an employee an answer or telling them how to do their job, which is more of a command and control type style, with a coaching style, you assume the employee has the wisdom within to come to the answers on their own. So sometimes you might know a possible answer, or sometimes this is the case with employees who handle very specific technical information. You might not. And if you provide an answer, you're going to limit the possible outcomes. So you're generally going to want to ask open-ended questions. Open-ended questions require a thought process to come to an answer. When employees are involved in creating the solution, they are more likely to buy into whatever the result is. For the most part, you'll want to avoid narrow questions that are directive. For example, ask, what's the next best step to take, as opposed to, what type of meeting do you need to have to move the project forward? The broader the questions are, the more the employee thinks about possible options and responses. If the questions are narrow, the manager is really in problem-solving mode and more directive, even though the question appears open-ended. Finally, generally try to avoid questions that start with why, as they often make employees feel defensive. Asking why can imply that you think the result was wrong or can appear judgmental. You can ask something like, tell me about your thought process, instead of asking an employee why they did or didn't do something. This assumes a positive intent and comes across as curious and non-judgmental. So here's some examples of open-ended questions versus closed questions. In the first example, you can ask, what's the status of a project? That's going to gather more information than a simple yes or no that you're going to get by asking if a person's finished. And then asking, well, you won't do that again, right? That's judgmental. It's going to be disempowering, and it's likely going to make your employee feel bad. So instead say, what can you learn from this? That takes a situation that could be viewed as a mistake, and it turns it around into a more positive opportunity for learning. When employees are given a supportive environment that allows them to learn from things that might otherwise be viewed as failures, within reason, of course, this can really positively impact their development. They can definitely quickly apply these lessons to similar scenarios in ways that might not have otherwise happened. And so in the final example, how many times have you simply asked an employee if instructions are clear and the employee just said yes, only for you to realize later that they didn't understand? Providing an opportunity for them to repeat an assignment back is going to demonstrate any areas of miscommunication. So it can be better to say something like, to ensure we're on the same page, please tell me your understanding of the assignment. So I know this is a lot of information. We've stayed pretty high level. So to help pull all of the information together, I'm going to give some practical examples as to how to implement coaching in a few different situations. So it's important to remember that coaching doesn't always mean that an employee isn't performing well. And so to reiterate something I mentioned before, coaching is used to help continually improve performance and develop employees. A time that coaching can be really useful is when an employee comes to you and asks you how to do something or what to do in a situation that you know is within their potential to figure out without you just providing a potential answer or solution. So what I'm going to talk about, this would not generally be a method to use with a new hire or somebody who's in a training period. I'm talking about someone who's been with the company long enough to understand the job. I've managed a lot of employees over the years, and it's really common that employees, and particularly entry-level employees, they come to managers with questions about how to do tasks that they can really solve themselves. And I found that they do this either because they don't have confidence in their problem-solving abilities, or because they aren't confident that they have the authority to make a decision, or sometimes they just don't really want the responsibility for making a decision. Or then, sometimes they don't realize that they know the answer. They just simply need to talk it over with a manager to help see the situation from a different perspective. So I know that sometimes it can be just quicker to provide an answer, but ultimately you're going to make your job easier in the long run when you help empower the employee to learn to come to their own solutions. So over time, that's going to help the employee learn and reduce their dependence on the supervisor. So depending on the situation, there's all sorts of questions that can elicit your employee's problem-solving abilities. So here's some examples. So asking the employee to tell you about the situation and what they've already done gives you context. You can even use a coaching standby. Tell me more about that to learn about the situation. Asking what the employee proposes gives permission for them to try to solve the problem. In the event that the employee doesn't have an immediate solution to the problem, you can try a variety of approaches. Asking the employee what their goal or desired outcome is can help give them clarity on this point. It's surprising how often employees try to make a decision, but they haven't actually articulated a clear end result or desired outcome. And so in doing so, this can sometimes make the path to get to the goal much clearer. Asking a question like, what are some different ways that you might approach the situation, or what could be your next step, or what options do you have, gets the employees thinking about potential solutions. Depending on the employee's responses, you could ask follow-up questions related to the various options, such as, what are the pros and cons of each approach? So this has the employee and not the manager identify the strengths and weaknesses in each of the options that they've presented. As such, the employee has to use critical thinking skills to come up with responses. And then finally, you can ask the employee to identify what approach they think is most effective. When an employee has participated in problem solving and identifying a solution, they're going to be much more likely to be bought into the solution. And they're also going to oftentimes be able to apply the same thought process to other situations, and that's going to help their growth. So another scenario that you might have is an employee who needs help project managing a task. So that can be quite common when an employee is highly technically skilled or good at management, but they don't have much project management experience. So sometimes large projects that are going to extend over multiple months or years, they can just feel really overwhelming to employees. They can simply need help breaking them down into smaller parts to help create the project plan. Asking some simple questions can help them stop seeing the projects as daunting and overwhelming and help them break it into manageable parts. So first, it's important that they have a clear picture of the end result. Oftentimes, an employee has been given a large project, but they don't really have a clear idea of what's expected of them, or the manager's idea of the end result and the employee's idea are very different. Sometimes the employee is envisioning a much larger project than the manager's imagining, or sometimes the reverse. So it's really important to ensure that your expectations are aligned. So a question like, what's a successful final outcome look like, can help you determine what the employee is envisioning and ensure you're on the same page. So you can also have the employee do a bit of a visioning exercise to imagine that the project is finished, simply by saying, envision that you're finished with the project. Describe the final project. This gets them into a creative problem-solving mode. Now, in the event that this is interrupted by the employee describing obstacles, you can say things like, for now, let's pretend that that obstacle doesn't exist. Just describe what you want the final product to look like. But you will want to take note of whatever the obstacles were so that later you can ask additional coaching questions to ensure that they don't get in the way of success. But for now, you just want the employee thinking about the final product and not getting distracted by potential problems. So once the employee has an idea of the end goal, there's a couple ways to break the project down into parts using open-ended questions. So one way is to work backwards from the final deadline and ask what needs to be done by certain time frames. Another is to ask what needs to be done immediately. So in other words, if you need to complete the project by December 10th, what needs to be done in the next 3 months? What needs to be done by the end of September, etc. Then you can have the employee create a project plan that breaks these tasks down even further as needed. You'll also want to ensure that the action items and dates that the employee is committing to are attainable and realistic. And so another thing that employees may need help with on large projects, particularly at large organizations, is understanding what coworkers should be involved in the project. It can be a good idea to ask some questions to ensure that the employee has identified all the people on the project team and that the employee is clear on how communication between team members in different departments will happen. So input from different people in a workplace is needed for different reasons. If someone's not consulted, they could derail a project, or they might be working on a similar project, or they may have some level of authority over a project. And so helping the employee think through that, instead of simply advising about that, is going to help them learn about organizational dynamics. Finally, you can ask a question about what the employee is going to do to ensure success. This helps keep the conversation focused on the positive, but it can also pull in some strategizing about those obstacles that they may have mentioned earlier. One thing to watch out for, though, is be sure that you don't just accept any limiting beliefs at face value. So in other words, you want to challenge an employee's assumption that they can't do something, or challenge unfounded assumptions that there's limitations that will stop them from getting something finished. Your job when coaching employees is to help them grow and help them motivate them to move outside of their comfort zone. So another time you might use coaching questions is as an alternative to providing feedback when one of your employees completed a task. So you could provide constructive criticism right off the bat, but it can be much more effective if you facilitate the employee coming to their own conclusion about what worked well and what could go better. So let's just say that your employee brings you a PowerPoint presentation that you think needs some more work to have the intended message to clients. Some managers might tend to review the presentation and mark it up and then go over it with the employee to explain why they made the edits that they did. So there could be some learning in that for the employee, but it's a lot more work for the manager, and it's more directive. And then that can also create dependence on the manager for such assistance in the future. So with a coaching approach, you could ask the employee a question like, what's the desired message of this presentation? And so if the employee doesn't have a clear message, then you can clarify that. But assuming there's a clear message, then you can follow up with the question, how effective do you think the current draft is at communicating your intended message? And you're going to want to remember not to ask, do you think that the current draft is effective at communicating your current message? Because that's a totally different question. That's a closed question, and it's only going to give you a yes or no. It can also put employees on the defensive. An open-ended question requires them to think and assess the strengths and weaknesses in what they've created. So you can then follow up with questions about how the employee could strengthen the delivery of the intended message. And because the employee is coming up with the answer, they don't feel like they're being told what to do or being micromanaged. Assuming the manager is supportive and there's a trusting environment, the employee feels like they're being given room to grow and learn. And assuming you've got some specific feedback in mind, but the employee didn't point it out, you could ask a bit more of a pointed question, but do try to keep it open-ended, and with the employee making the observations wherever possible. So for example, if there's a section that you think is confusing in the PowerPoint in the order that it's in, you might say, tell me about your decision to put this slide after the section about the new product lines. That way you can hear the employee's rationale for the decision prior to giving any feedback. The employee may realize on their own that there could be a better placement for the slide, or you may realize there's a logical reason for the current placement, or there could be an entirely different solution. Okay, so now we've gotten into more depth with coaching, let's switch gears a bit to talk about performance evaluations. So we could spend, an hour or more talking about performance evaluations alone. So we're going to stay pretty high level with the remaining time that we have. The performance evaluation is part of the overall performance management process, which I'll talk more about in just a minute. So one definition of performance evaluation is the process of reviewing how well employees perform their duties during a specified period of time. Performance evaluations serve the purpose of giving employees positive performance feedback and recognition for accomplishments during the review period. They also serve to provide discussion of needed areas of improvement, and they're a venue to discuss career development and future goals. And finally, the performance evaluation will generally be used to justify whether or not the employer receives a compensation increase. Okay, so here we see a diagram of a typical performance management cycle. The performance evaluation is just one piece of the process. So ultimately, the goal of the performance management cycle is to ensure that you have a highly performing organization because you maintain or continually improve individual performance. The first step is performance planning, in which the employee and supervisor collaborate to develop a performance plan that details the goals and objectives for the coming review period. So at this time, you can also ensure that the two of you are on the same page about the employee's career aspirations. Throughout the review period, there's going to be ongoing informal coaching or perhaps even formal coaching sessions aimed at continuous improvement. The manager will then assess the employee's performance based on the employee's completion of their goals and on objective job-related criteria. These criteria should be understood by the employee in advance. So for example, many companies use performance competencies in addition to rating on specific job goals. We'll talk a bit more about that later. Finally, the performance review will be created based on an assessment of how well the employee completed their performance goals and an evaluation of performance and core competency areas. You will also discuss developmental goals and plan for the next review period as well. Please note that throughout the entire cycle, there's both performance feedback and support from the manager. These are critical to ensure that the employee understands what's expected of them and whether or not they're meeting their goals. Now we'll talk a bit more about creating a performance evaluation. So it's really common to have an annual performance review cycle, so meaning that the employee receives a formal written review once per year. And there's pros and cons to that approach. And there's definitely a trend towards more frequent evaluations. Workplaces aren't stagnant and business needs can change very quickly. More frequent evaluations provide flexibility to match changing workplace conditions. They allow you both to recalibrate an employee's goals as workplace needs require, and to discuss mid-year course corrections where needed when performance isn't meeting expectations. They ensure that regular performance check-ins are occurring on a more frequent basis because they're required by the process. Additionally, more frequent evaluations mean that performance conversations aren't all tied to salary conversations, and that should help produce more meaningful data. Ideally, more frequent performance meetings pave the way for ongoing quality conversations with managers and their employees about performance. But with all that said, so many small employers may not currently have a formal performance management process at all. And if that's your organization, you may think that simply implementing an annual review process sounds like a daunting process. Or some organizations may have a hard time getting their annual reviews completed on time. And the idea of implementing a more frequent process for those employers could be overwhelming, even if there's abbreviated paperwork requirements outside of one annual more formal review. So in that case, it's important to ensure that the process that's implemented is one that can be sustainable and one that's going to happen. It's just not a good idea to promise employees a performance review on a cycle that doesn't happen with regularity. So while there's definitely can be benefits to a more frequent review cycle, if this is something that's not likely to be implemented well or be sustainable for your organization, it's definitely not an advisable option. Okay, so let's talk about the format of your performance evaluation. There's really no one perfect answer on what a performance review should look like. And as a matter of fact, there's totally many conflicting opinions out there about this. And unfortunately, there are lots of studies that say both employees and managers aren't happy with the performance management systems being used at their companies. A Watson-Wyatt survey showed that only 3 out of 10 workers agree that their company's performance management system improves performance. Similarly, a Deloitte survey of nearly 3,000 executives from companies around the globe found that nearly 58% of the respondents didn't believe the company's performance management process drove either employee engagement or high performance. And dozens of other research projects on performance management conducted over the past decade found similar conclusions. So you might be thinking, well, why should we bother? And a really small number of companies out there, less than 1%, they've ditched performance reviews altogether. But the experts caution that if you do this, you still have to have some kind of formal feedback mechanism. And it can be really difficult to implement that well. Companies that don't have formal review processes can put a lot of burden on the managers to have performance conversations, and that can fall through the cracks when there's no formal process that mandates it. And so the reason I bring up all that data is that I just like to go ahead and acknowledge that it can be difficult to create a performance evaluation that makes everybody in an organization happy. And if you don't already have a performance review process, it may well not be perfect on the first try. So with all that said, we'll go over the types of things that are typically found in a performance evaluation. So common pieces of the performance evaluation include a manager review, self-assessment, and then goal setting for the upcoming period. Sometimes the reviews will contain coworker input, but there's some caveats to that. And I'll talk more about each of the pieces of the evaluation in the next few slides. So the manager's portion of the review, it's often going to include competency ratings. A performance competency is typically a defined set of behaviors that the company's defined or has determined are important. And so in other words, performance objectives on the work plan could be thought of as the what of the job, while performance competencies are the how of the job. Some competencies might be measured company-wide, and then others might be measured at the job family level. And so these are the behavioral characteristics that the company has determined impact results. So for example, some examples of competencies are communication, teamwork, and leadership, delivering results, and relationship building. And so companies, they can get really specific about how they define these things. Narrowing this down to a small list of critical competencies is going to help keep your system simple. And generally, if using competencies, there's going to be some type of rating scale. Rating scales can be numeric, such as a scale from 1 to 5, or the ratings can correspond with an adjective such as satisfactory, excellent, or other words such as meets expectations, exceeds expectations, so forth. Or the words could describe how often the behavior is exhibited, such as consistently, most of the time, inconsistently, and so forth. So there's an argument for not using too many ratings, limiting to smaller numbers, because managers, they tend not to be so sophisticated in their ability to differentiate performance when there are a large number on your rating scales. And then additionally, like if you use a 7-point scale, for example, managers, they may focus on the middle or drift upwards. Another thing is that many companies are moving away from the use of numerical ratings. There's some research that shows that a rating system can inhibit employee collaboration, and when numerical ratings and forced ranking is removed, that collaboration in the workplace increases. So in any case, if you do use ratings, you're going to want to ensure that each level is clearly defined and that managers are trained in the system and that they understand what performance at each level looks like so that the levels are applied consistently. In addition to competency and rating information, the manager review should have information about how well the employees completed their goals from the last cycle. So you're going to want to ensure that specific projects the employee completed are captured in the review and any feedback about them is given. You're going to want to capture general feedback about the employee's performance. It's important to honestly assess performance and not sugarcoat the written evaluation. It really is amazing how often we hear that a client wants to terminate poor performance, but they've got glowing reviews on file. And as I mentioned before, assuming that there's ongoing feedback and coaching happening, nothing in the manager review should be a surprise to the employee. So ideally, the self-assessment should mirror the manager review. The purpose of the self-review is to make employees think about their own performance and to take a critical look about how they did over the review period. The self-review, it enables the manager to see if employees have an accurate understanding of their own job performance. A self-review can enable the manager to ensure that no key accomplishments have been left out of the manager review as well. So sometimes managers are so far removed from the employee's work that they miss accomplishments at review time. Self-reviews take advantage of the employee's familiarity with their day-to-day work. They also highlight parts of performance that are important to the employee. And employees all over the spectrum of performance are required to evaluate how they're doing, not just those at the high and low ends. Self-reviews can draw manager attentions to things that they might otherwise miss. Self-reviews also enable the performance review process to be more participatory, and they give the employee involvement and a voice in what's documented about their performance. So a lot of companies have removed ratings from the employee section of the review, and they only include narrative questions about the objectives. You know, a lot of employers think that having employees rate themselves just isn't a useful exercise. Some employees will honestly rate themselves, but a lot of them just give themselves the highest ratings. So if you do include ratings, you're going to want to ensure that you've got some guidelines, such as, you know, most employees are going to score 3 out of 5, things like that. Okay, so when talking about coworker assessment, I am just going to go ahead and admit that I'm not a huge fan of having coworker data in performance reviews for a variety of reasons. So when we hear the term 360-degree review, most people think about informally gathering coworker input. But a true 360-degree review, it's a tool that's best used only for development and is not related to the performance appraisal or rating process. When we talk about a true 360, these are done by outside companies, a third party, who can ensure that there's enough respondents to keep the data confidential. When used for development, a supervisor may often not even see the results of a 360. The true purpose is for employee learning. So while they have some advantages, 360s have kind of fallen out of favor for use in performance ratings. This is because they often lack reliable and valid data, and it's actually really easy to make mistakes in how they're administered. 360s can provide broader input than just what the direct supervisor sees, and that can be particularly useful if the manager works in a different location than the employee. It can also be really useful to see how the employee is perceived by others. However, a lot of times there's problems in that there's no context to who is providing comments. Employees providing input may have no real understanding about the highly skilled technical requirements of an employee's job. You know, worse, the comments that employees give that could be motivated by office politics. And employees who is after the same promotion could write negative comments about an employee, or employees could actually band together and decide to write only positive comments about each other. And then another consideration is that often there aren't enough people in a department for the data to be truly anonymous. That can cause reviewers to be cautious about providing truthful data, and it can enable employees to determine who said what and to attempt to retaliate against people who gave constructive comments. You know, and additionally, 360 data can be time-consuming, and it's going to add additional work to your process. You know, I've really seen a lot of strange things happen with informal 360 data. I've seen a manager who tried to determine exactly who said what during the 360 and then treated his staff differently based on incorrect assumptions about who said what. So obviously there was, you know, a bigger problem, and that's another story, but in that situation. But, you know, when employers use an anonymous format in another situation, I've also seen harassment complaints come in by a 360 process, and those can get hard to investigate in that format. So for 360 data to be successful, there's got to be a strong culture of communication and trust in an organization. My recommendation is, if you wish to use this type of data, that you keep 360 feedback as part of the development process and not tied to performance ratings or pay increases. And ideally, you'd use an outside vendor to do a formal 360 as part of your development process. So you're also going to generally do goal setting and a discussion about professional development as part of the annual review. And so let's briefly talk about SMART goals. The acronym stands for specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. I've seen tons of performance reviews, and it's really surprising how few of them truly have SMART goals in them on the first draft, or ones that appear smart on the surface, but you know, they actually aren't. So SMART goals help ensure that you're going to be able to measure whether the employee succeeded in meeting the expectations when you go to review their performance at the next cycle. So for example, if you have an employee that's having a problem with time management and you state, Jane should delegate more of her tasks, that's not a SMART goal. You're not actually going to be able to measure whether that happened or not. But if instead you say, in the next review period, Jane should delegate at least 5 of her responsibilities to her team members, that gives the information in which it will happen. It says more specifics about what will happen, and presumably it's attainable. So it's also clearly measurable as to whether or not it happened. Depending on the complexity of employee jobs, some performance plans are also going to include a place for employees to detail action items to work towards their performance goals. So to continue our example, an action item would be to identify the tasks to delegate, the team members to delegate to, and timeframes in which this would happen. Okay, so to wrap things up, We'll talk a bit about the performance meeting itself and follow up after the meeting. So let's talk briefly about the timing of the evaluation. As discussed, so typically the employee and the manager, they're both going to have forms to complete. Some processes are going to kick off with the manager receiving an employee self-review, and some processes are going to have the manager and the employee exchange forms close to the same time. In any case, it's good to have an employee receive their manager's written assessment prior to the meeting so that the employee is able to process any emotions ahead of time and they know what to expect. So to ensure a successful meeting, the manager should be prepared. The manager should set a comfortable environment for the meeting. You know, and it's really common that managers approach this conversation with a feedback sandwich. So in other words, they start with positive information and they give constructive information and they end on a positive note. You know, and I know that this is a technique that many people were taught at some point along the way. But this technique, it can be demotivating to your top performers, and it can falsely encourage those who aren't performing well. So a better approach is to really just pick a side and focus on it. So for your folks that are doing well, stay with the positive input. Then use coaching after you've discussed their strengths and achievements. Ask the employee how they think things are going. This should elicit an honest conversation about what's going well and what could be going better. And then you should be specific with your input. So don't say things like you're really innovative. It's just not measurable at all. Be specific. What specifically did they do well? And then think about and discuss with the employee, what behaviors do you want your employee to stop, start, and continue? And then for your poor performers, particularly those who just aren't doing well after a lot of coaching, I know this can be really challenging for a lot of us, but don't sugarcoat that review. This is your opportunity to demand that things improve. Remember that you want to be specific, you want to focus on behavior and not the individual. And so finally, you'll want to finalize any paperwork related to the review and ensure that it ends up in the employee file. And then you're going to want to ensure that there's informal and frequent check-in on the employee's goals to ensure that everyone's on the same page and that you're coaching where needed and readjusting goals if your business needs require that. So I know that we've covered just a ton of information in our time together today. If coaching is new for you, it might take a while to get a hang of using the open-ended questions with the coaching approach, but it can really be worth it when you see the results in increased employee performance. And that in turn is going to make your job at performance evaluation time much easier.
Wow, well, thank you so much for all of that, Amy. We're now going to take a moment to review some of the questions you guys have chatted in. It's not too late to ask questions now if you haven't already, so I'll let Amy take a sip of water, review the questions, and we will be back in just one moment. Thanks. All right, thank you so much, everyone. Just a quick reminder that a PDF of this PowerPoint can be downloaded under handouts right now, so you're welcome to go ahead and save that so you can review this later. And then one question we've got here, do you think pay should be coupled with performance management?
Yeah, great question. And so, I think that that's I think that that's a great question, and I think that there is definitely arguments, for and against that. And I think that there's certainly the sense that if you decouple pay and performance management systems, that you're going to get a lot more honest, manager input and employee input, and that there's, that performance management becomes more of a development tool. But certainly then, you have the arguments that there needs to be justification for compensation decisions. So it's really, I think it's one of those things that is going to be really company specific, and how that this is approached. And I think that there's many organizations out there struggling with this question, and it's one of those areas where I think that it's something that everyone needs to figure out what works well for them.
All right, thank you so much. And we have time for just one more question here. Can you give some additional tips on how to give feedback when an employee has done something wrong?
Yeah, and so, well, there's a lot of ways to look at that question. And I think a lot of times it's that kind of, it depends really on that situation, what the employee has done, and whether or not we can look at that as something that was wrong, or, whether we can look at that as something that could be, a lesson learned. But, let's say that we're looking at something that's more like, misconduct or something, or something that is a little bit more serious, as opposed to something that you could approach with more coaching. And one approach that you can do is really, it's called, a way of giving feedback that's called an SBI approach, and that stands for Situation, Behavior, Impact. And so you look at the situation, you look at the behavior, and you look at the impact. And so you talk about, what's happened, you talk about the behavior, and you talk about the impact of the behavior. And so with this, you're really like stepping away from things that could get the employee in a defensive mode. You're not sort of saying like, oh my God, you did this is so crazy. You want to really focus on, look, hey, when you just an example off the top of my head, when you didn't tell us that you lost a bank deposit, or, and we heard about it from the bank, that the impact on that was that we really had a loss of trust in you, and, also there was all this lost employee data that caused a security breach. And so you're talking about the impact of of what happened. So that's one way. And then you could talk about, then you could ask some of those open-ended questions to kind of get at sort of why the situation happened, and what could be done differently. So that's, it's kind of a broad question, but that's just some ideas.
Perfect. Well, my apologies for running a couple minutes over. Thank you so much for all of your insight, Amy, and thanks everyone for your time today. If you have the HR On Demand service activated and you want to speak with Amy or any of our other pros about this topic, please give us a call anytime. At this point, I'll go ahead and turn it back over to Kristen.
All right. Thank you so much, Amy, and thank you, Jenny. We appreciate such an informative insight over performance evaluations and effective coaching. Everyone, as Jenny just mentioned, if you're utilizing the HR module with BeyondPay, you do have access to the ability to have access to HR Support Center and that plethora of resources that we provide to you all to support you in your role as HR admin. And for partners and prospects who want to learn more about BeyondPay or want help with managing performance evaluations, HR processes, payroll, or time and labor management, we're here to provide those solutions to you. So as a follow-up, today's webinar, we are going to send out the slide deck. You can actually download it in the handout section of today's webinar, but we'll follow up with that also, and we will be sending you the recorded webinar too. So thank you so much again for your time. We hope you enjoyed today's insight, and you will be hearing us with follow-up email. And if you have any questions or conversation that you'd like to have with me in addition to today's insight, we are here and ready to help. So have an excellent Wednesday afternoon.